Hey everyone, how's it going? Matthew Kadish here, author of the Earthman Jack Space Saga, available on Amazon.com, and all-around nice guy, coming at you today with some big movie news, and that is that Venom 2 has been confirmed to be happening, and that Tom Hardy is going to be returning. Duh. So, for those of you who are fans of the original Venom movie, basically this is going to pick up right where that left off. It looks like it's going to kind of be Venom versus Carnage. In this one, as spoiler alert, we got Woody Harrelson appearing at the end credit scene of the first Venom film as the character who eventually becomes Carnage. So let's go through this Geek Tyrant article that kind of lays things out for us. It was recently confirmed that the sequel to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is already being worked on, which is great because Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was a fantastic movie. I know it's an animated film, but if you guys haven't seen it yet and you're a comic book fan, you got to check it out. It was probably one of the best Spider-Man films I've ever seen, so I really enjoyed that. I'm very happy that it's getting a sequel. Hopefully it becomes a franchise all on its own, and it introduces this whole multiverse concept, which allows various different types of Spider-Men to kind of come together and have adventures and stuff, and it was just really well done. I really enjoyed it. But anyway, getting back to the article. It seems that Sony is feeling great as their other Spider-Man spin-off film, Venom, is also getting a sequel. Venom did get a decent box office, so it's not entirely surprising that we're getting Venom 2. Amy Pascal, a producer on the Spider-Man films for Sony, told Fandango that Tom Hardy would be returning for the sequel. I can say that Tom Hardy will be back, magnificently playing that character as no one else can. It's a couple of things. One of them is that Sony did a great job creating that franchise and giving it a life and giving it its own world. Then there's Tom Hardy. When you think of Venom, you'll never be able to think of anyone but Tom Hardy sitting in that bathtub full of lobsters. And once you saw Tom Hardy do this character, that's all you needed to know. First of all, it wasn't a bathtub. It was basically a lobster tank that he kind of dunked himself in. So, Amy, watch your own movie occasionally. But yeah, for those of you who don't know, by the way, Amy Pascal, she used to be the head of Sony Pictures. She was the female CEO, and she was also the one responsible for the Ghostbusters 2016 fiasco and all that other stuff. So I'm not a huge fan of hers. The fact that she somehow was able to wiggle her way into shepherding and producing all these Spider-Man movies kind of irks me a little bit because I don't think she's a very good creative head. However, you can't argue with the movies that she's produced so far. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was great. Venom, the original movie, was pretty decent. It had its problems, but, considering that Alex Kurtzman was initially set to write and direct Venom, and it turned out as good as it did after going through so many upheavals, it's pretty impressive. But I think that these movies were good despite Amy Pascal, as opposed to because of her. But, who knows? Basically, she's probably the one who really pushed to have Venom 2 made. So to a certain extent, I believe, we do owe her a little bit of a thanks for continuing to get us Spider-Man films. Although, ideally, be good if, Sony reverted the rights to Spider-Man back to Marvel so they could do what they want with it. And we'll get into that in a little bit. When asked if Spider-Man would be in Venom 2, she responded with a simple, "Everybody would love to see that. You never know, someday it might happen." Kevin Feige from Marvel has said that if the two characters were to meet up, it would be up to Sony for it to happen. Do you want to see Venom 2? Would you like to see blah, blah, blah? All right, so this is kind of an important thing to note right here, where Kevin Feige basically says that if we want to see Spider-Man and Venom together, it's up to Sony for that to happen. Now, for those of you who don't know how all this works, Sony has had this iron death grip on the Spider-Man license, basically, since the early 2000s, back when Sam Raimi was making his Spider-Man movies. And those were such big successes that Sony didn't want to give up that license. And there's language written into these licensing contracts that basically says when, the studio has to make a Spider-Man movie or a movie with these characters every couple years. Otherwise, the license defaults back to the original license holder, which would be Marvel. So Sony has kind of kept their death grip on Spider-Man because they realize that it is a lucrative property. And the only reason Spider-Man has been able to return to the MCU is that Sony messed it up so badly with the Amazing Spider-Man movies, because they had this whole kind of cinematic universe planned out based around their Spider-Man properties. They had stuff like a Sinister Six movie. They had stuff like Silver Sable and Black Cat. They basically had all the rights to all these Spider-Man characters that they were planning to kind of make movies around. And when the Amazing Spider-Man movies bombed, Sony kind of stepped back and said, maybe we should think about, rebooting the character and teaming up with Marvel in order to do it. And, Marvel and Disney had been reaching out to them for a while now, I think. And so rather than kind of get in a legal battle where Marvel was fighting them for the rights to the character back, they kind of sat down and came up with a deal where basically Marvel would be allowed to use the character in their movies, and Sony would be allowed to use that character that Marvel created and make their own standalone Spider-Man movies and continue to use the Spider-Man characters and keep all the money from the movies. And Marvel, in exchange, would get all the money from the merchandising for Spider-Man. So the way that this team up worked was basically they came up with a deal for 3 standalone Spider-Man movies. And basically Sony would produce those movies. If you notice that Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home are actually Sony pictures. They don't have anything to do with Disney or Marvel necessarily, even though Marvel can attach their name to it because Spider-Man is their character. The Spider-Man movies are actually produced by Sony, and they're produced under Amy Pascal's production company. So Marvel actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with the Spider-Man movies themselves, the standalone movies, but they do have a lot to do with how they use the characters within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So basically, they have one more movie in their agreement before they have to kind of renegotiate. And what's been happening in the build-up to that, in the meantime, as Sony's been doing the Spider-Man standalone movies, is that they've been rolling out this plan that they've had for a long time to kind of do Spider-Man spin-offs. So Venom was like their first shot across the bow, and Into the Spiderverse is among that as well. And they have, I believe, a Silver Sable and Black Cat movie kind of in the works. And it's unclear if there's a Sinister Six movie kind of out there percolating still. But Venom was kind of their test run of, can they do Spider-Man spin-off films without Spider-Man? And it was a success, basically. And so basically now Sony's in a position where they think that they might not need Marvel anymore. So after the third standalone Spider-Man movie, it's kind of up in the air as to whether or not the MCU version, the Tom Holland version of Spider-Man, is going to continue. And when Kevin Feige says that if Venom and the MCU version of Spider-Man were to meet up, it's entirely up to Sony for that to happen, which means that basically Sony would probably have to negotiate another deal for the character of Venom, because you got to remember that Sony has the rights to all these different Spider-Man related characters, kind of like how Fox had the rights to the Fantastic Four and all of their related characters, which is why you never saw Silver Surfer, Galactus, Doctor Doom, stuff like that in any of the MCU movies leading up to Endgame and Infinity War, because those characters were basically owned by another studio, essentially. And it wasn't until Disney acquired Fox that they were able to bring those characters back in the fold. And now we're going to get those characters reincorporated into the MCU. Right now, all the Spider-Man characters are still separate from the MCU. And the only character that Marvel and Sony have made a deal over was the character of Spider-Man, which is probably one of the reasons why we have a different MJ in the Spider-Man movies, because the original Mary Jane is still licensed out to Sony, and she wasn't part of that Marvel crossover deal. So there's probably a lot of stuff that's still up in the air. I mean, who knows? But that's probably one of the reasons why we're not going to see a team up anytime soon, is because Sony wants to launch Venom off into its own franchise. And if they bring it into the Marvel universe, they're going to have to come up with some type of deal with Marvel where, maybe it's like Spider-Man where they have to give up the merchandising revenue. But the thing about merchandising revenue is that it's a big part of the back end of what makes these movies profitable. So Sony understandably probably wouldn't want to give that up. So I doubt we're going to see a crossover between Venom and Spider-Man anytime soon, unfortunately. But I guess it's not out of the realm of possibility. However, if Venom 2 goes on to be a success, even bigger success than Venom 1, I doubt that we're going to see Sony want to continue to share these characters with Marvel. And just a final bit of news on the Venom 2 front is that there's now talk that Andy Serkis is going to be directing Venom 2. And they haven't settled on a director yet. Basically, the guy who directed the first Venom film, Ruben Fleischer, he's stepping down. He's not coming back for the sequel. So Sony is kind of looking for someone new to kind of take the reins and take over. And there are a couple directors being kind of bandied about here, but Andy Serkis seems to be at the forefront. And some of you might know Serkis, he was in Black Panther, but, famously he did the motion capture for the character of Gollum, and he was, the Gollum voice in Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. So he's been actually transitioning to directing movies lately. And the most recent one he did was Mowgli, Legend of the Jungle, which was an adaptation of the Jungle Book, basically, which ended up on Netflix. And much like Disney's recent Lion King movie, that had a lot of special effects and stuff in it, a lot of CGI characters and animals and stuff like that. And Serkis's background in motion capture and acting for CGI really kind of geared him towards being an expert for that movie. And so because Venom is going to be so heavily CGI in terms of the Venom character and Carnage, Sony kind of wants someone who's well qualified for directing heavy CGI characters and stuff of that nature. So Andy Serkis is, of course, being looked at to fill that role. And I think that if Serkis does get the job, his teaming up with Tom Hardy is probably going to be a pretty good thing because Tom Hardy, let's face it, Tom Hardy was the guy who carried Venom. It was basically his charisma, his line delivery and stuff like that, that made the movie enjoyable because Lord knows the script script needed some work, but he, for some reason, he was able to carry the movie through. And I think him and Serkis together, because they're both very talented actors and stuff like that, they could really bring the movie down to a good character-centric piece where, it's Carnage versus Venom and Woody Harrelson versus Tom Hardy. And I just think, I think that there's a lot of stuff in place where that movie could work and it could be really good. So I'm excited to see how Venom 2 is going to shape up. I'm excited to see, what they're going to come up with. The only thing that I'm worried about is that Venom does so well that, it continues to allow Sony to kind of have this death grip on the Spider-Man license, and it keeps it out of Marvel's hands, so Spider-Man can never truly be converted into the MCU or incorporated into the MCU. Anyway, guys, what do you think of this? Are you excited about Venom 2? Let me know in the comments section of this video, and also please subscribe if you haven't already, and follow my channel for more movie, TV, and entertainment news and analysis. This is Matthew Kadish. I will catch you guys in the next video.